What he did to me over the phone was unbelievable. I never imagined that my life would take such a sharp turn that evening. We were living in Boulder, Colorado, a peaceful place where you could hear the wind rustling through the trees and the quiet hum of family life. My ex-husband, let's call him Tom, and I had been married for a few years by this point. We shared a decent life together, raising my 12-year-old son, Michael, in a comfortable home. Like most families, we had our ups and downs, but that night, everything changed. It was supposed to be an ordinary evening. Michael was finishing up his homework at the dining table, and I was in the kitchen, preparing dinner. The smell of spaghetti sauce simmering on the stove filled the air, mixing with the sound of Michael's pencil scribbling across his notebook. Tom had just come home from work, looking exhausted. He had one of those jobs that drain the life out of you, and lately, it seemed to be wearing him down more than usual. I didn't think much of it when he poured himself a drink. He often did that to unwind after a long day. But that night, something was different. He didn't stop at just one drink. Before I knew it, he had poured himself another, and then another. I could hear the sound of the glass clinking against the counter as he poured each one, and I started to feel uneasy. It wasn't like Tom to drink so much, especially with Michael around. As I stirred the sauce, I glanced over at him. His eyes were glassy, his movements slower than usual. I asked him if everything was all right, but instead of a simple response, he exploded. His words were slurred, and his voice grew louder with each passing second. He started ranting about things that didn't make sense, his job, our relationship, even old arguments we'd had years ago. It was like all the frustration he'd been bottling up suddenly came pouring out. At first, I tried to calm him down. I reminded him that Michael was right there, but that only seemed to make things worse. He slammed his hand down on the table, causing Michael to jump in his seat. My heart raced as I watched the situation spiral out of control. Michael's eyes were wide with fear, and I felt a knot tighten in my chest. This wasn't just about Tom having a rough day, something deeper was going on, and it was happening right in front of my child. I quickly ushered Michael into his room, telling him to finish his homework there. As he gathered his things and left the dining room, I could see the confusion and fear on his face. He had never seen Tom like this before, and neither had I, at least not to this extent. I closed the door behind him, hoping to shield him from what was happening, but the damage had already been done. I knew Michael had seen enough to leave an impression, and that realization hit me like a ton of bricks. Back in the kitchen, I turned to Tom. He was still rambling, pacing back and forth, his anger growing by the second. I tried to talk to him, but he was too far gone. His words were sharp and cutting, and I felt the sting of each one. It wasn't just the alcohol talking, it was something more. He had been struggling with his own demons for a while now, and this was the breaking point. As he continued his tirade, I felt a wave of sadness wash over me. This wasn't the man I had married. Tom had always been caring, even if he was a bit rough around the edges. But somewhere along the way, things had changed. He had changed. And now, standing there in the middle of our home, watching him unravel, I realized that our marriage was hanging by a thread. I had to make a decision, and fast. I couldn't let Michael be exposed to this. He was only 12, still figuring out the world, and he didn't need to see the man who was supposed to be a father figure to him acting this way. I had to protect him, even if it meant making some hard choices. That night, after Tom finally passed out on the couch, I sat down at the dining table, staring at the mess of unfinished homework and the cold plate of spaghetti. I couldn't shake the image of Michael's frightened face, or the sound of Tom's angry voice echoing in my ears. It was clear to me that things couldn't go on like this. something had to change. The next morning, I woke up with a pit in my stomach. Tom was still asleep, his face buried in a pillow, and Michael was getting ready for school. I pulled him aside before he left and told him that we were going to stay with my sister for a little while. He didn't ask why, but I could tell he understood. He had seen enough the night before to know that things weren't okay. As I packed a bag for the both of us, I felt a mixture of relief and guilt. I knew leaving was the right thing to do, but it wasn't easy. I had invested so much in my marriage, in our life together, and walking away felt like giving up. But at the same time, I knew that staying would only make things worse, especially for Michael. Before I left a note for Tom. I didn't want to confront him while he was still in that state, so I wrote down everything I needed to say. I told him that we needed some time apart, that I was taking Michael to a safer place, and that we would talk once things had calmed down. As I folded the note and placed it on the counter, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. Leaving the house that day felt like stepping into the unknown. I didn't know what the future held for us, but I knew one thing for sure: I had to do what was best for Michael. And that meant creating a safer environment for him, even if it meant leaving behind the life we had built. The day we moved out felt surreal, like a blur of emotions, decisions, and hurried steps. My sister, Laura, lived only a few miles away, so I called her first thing in the morning. I didn't give her too many details, just told her that Michael and I needed a place to stay for a while. Laura, being the supportive sister she is, didn't ask many questions, just said, "Come over whenever you're ready." It didn't take long to pack. After all, we were only taking what was necessary. A few bags of clothes, some personal items, and Michael's school supplies. As I shoved our belongings into the car, Michael stood there silently, holding his backpack and watching me. I could see the confusion in his eyes, but he didn't say much. He's always been a thoughtful kid, the kind who keeps his feelings to himself until he's ready to talk about them. I knew he was trying to process everything that had happened, just as I was. The drive to Laura's house was quiet. Michael sat in the back seat, staring out the window, and I kept glancing at him in the rearview mirror. I wanted to say something, anything, to make him feel better, but the words just wouldn't come. How do you explain to a 12-year-old that the life they've known is about to change? That we're leaving because the person who was supposed to protect us had become someone we couldn't trust? When we arrived at Laura's, she greeted us with open arms, ushering us inside and helping carry our bags. She didn't push for details, just gave me a look that said, "I'm here for you." I appreciated that more than anything because I wasn't ready to explain what had happened. I still hadn't fully processed it myself. Once inside, Michael headed straight to the spare room, tossing his backpack on the bed and pulling out his homework. I could tell he was trying to act like everything was normal, like this was just another day. But I knew better. His silence spoke volumes. Laura made us some tea, and we sat at the kitchen table. "You're welcome to stay as long as you need," she said softly, placing a hand on mine. I nodded, grateful for her support but feeling the weight of the situation settling on my shoulders. This wasn't just a temporary arrangement, this was the beginning of something much bigger. The first few days at Laura's were a whirlwind. Michael went to school, I went to work, and we tried to keep up with our routines, but it was clear that things were different now. Every time I dropped Michael off at school, I felt a pang of guilt. I wondered if he was okay, if he was worried about Tom, if he missed our home. But every time I asked him how he was doing, he just shrugged and said he was fine. I wasn't fine, though. My mind was constantly racing, thinking about Tom, about what had happened, and what was going to happen next. I kept replaying that night in my head, the sound of his voice, the look in his eyes. I wanted to help him, to fix whatever was broken, but I knew deep down that it wasn't something I could fix. He needed help, but it wasn't the kind of help I could offer. One evening, about a week after we moved in with Laura, I got a call from Tom. I hesitated for a moment before answering. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I wasn't sure what to expect. Would he be angry? Apologetic? I wasn't ready for another meltdown. When I picked up, his voice was quiet, almost too calm. "Where are you?" he asked. I could hear the exhaustion in his voice, the weight of everything pressing down on him. I took a deep breath and told him the truth. I told him we were staying with Laura for a while, that I needed to give Michael some space and time away from the tension. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and then he said, "I'm sorry." His voice cracked, and for a moment, I thought I might cry. He sounded so broken, so lost, and it hurt to hear him like that. Despite everything, I still cared about him. I didn't want him to suffer, but I couldn't go back to how things were. "I know you are," I replied softly, trying to keep my own emotions in check. "But things have to change, Tom. We can't keep going like this. It's not fair to Michael, and it's not fair to us." "I want to fix things," he said. "I'm going to get help. I know I need it." That was the first glimmer of hope I'd heard in a long time. Maybe, just maybe, he was starting to see the gravity of the situation. But I wasn't ready to jump back into the relationship just because he said the right things. Words were one thing, actions were another. "I hope you do," I told him. "But for now, we need to stay apart. You need to focus on getting better, and I need to focus on Michael." After we hung up, I sat at the table for a long time, staring at my phone. I didn't know if he would follow through on his promise to get help, but at least he was acknowledging the problem. That was a start. The next few weeks were tough. Michael was adjusting, but I could tell he was struggling. He asked about Tom a few times, and I tried to explain things in a way that he could understand. "Your dad is going through a tough time right now," I said. "He needs to work on himself before we can figure things out." Michael just nodded, but I could tell he was worried. He loved Tom, despite everything, and I didn't want to take that away from him. But I also knew I had to protect him from the instability that had crept into our lives. As the days went by, I started to feel a little more settled. We were still living in limbo, but there was a sense of peace that came with being away from the chaos. I knew this was the right choice for us, even if it was hard. After we settled into my sister Laura's house, life slowly started to fall into a new routine. It wasn't easy, though. Every morning, I would wake up to the sounds of her house, which was different from what I had been used to for years. The creak of her floorboards, the hum of her old refrigerator, even the way the light filtered through the blinds felt unfamiliar. It wasn't our home, but it was a safe space, and for now, that was all that mattered. Michael adjusted better than I expected, but he's always been a resilient kid. He still got up for school every morning without a fuss, packed his backpack, and tried to go about his day as if everything was normal. But I knew better. I could see the weight he was carrying, even if he didn't say much about it. Every afternoon, when I picked him up from school, I'd ask him how his day was, and he'd always give me the same answer: "It was fine." That was it. No details, no extra conversation. I knew he was processing everything in his own way, but I couldn't help but worry. As much as I wanted to sit him down and talk about everything, I didn't want to push him. He'd talk when he was ready. As for me, I went through the motions. I kept going to work, even though my mind wasn't fully there. I would sit at my desk, answering emails, and attending meetings, but I was constantly thinking about Tom, about what our future would look like, about whether or not I had made the right choice by moving out. Every now and then, a wave of guilt would wash over me, but then I'd remind myself why I was doing this. Michael needed stability. He needed me to be strong, even when I wasn't sure I had the strength. At Laura's, the evenings were a bit different from what we were used to. Laura had her own routine, and we had to fit into it. She worked late some nights, and on those evenings, it was just Michael and me. We'd eat dinner together at her small dining table, the sound of forks clinking against plates filling the quiet air. Sometimes we'd watch TV after, but other times, Michael would head to his room, and I'd find myself alone, lost in my thoughts. One evening, after Michael had gone to bed, Laura and I sat together in the living room. She had poured us both a glass of wine, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I let myself relax a little. "You've been holding it together pretty well," she said, giving me a soft smile. "But you don't have to be so strong all the time." I sighed, feeling the weight of her words sink in. "I don't know if I'm holding it together as well as it seems," I admitted. "It's been tough, but I have to keep going for Michael." Laura nodded. "I know. But don't forget to take care of yourself, too. You can't pour from an empty cup, you know." I knew she was right, but it was hard to focus on myself when there was so much uncertainty surrounding us. I didn't know what was going to happen with Tom, and that uncertainty was eating away at me. Part of me wanted to call him every day, check in, see how he was doing, but I knew that wasn't healthy. We needed space, and I had to respect that. A few weeks passed, and while our new routine became more familiar, the uncertainty still loomed. Tom had called a couple of times, just to check in, but our conversations were short and awkward. He always sounded tired, worn out, and I wasn't sure if he was really doing the work he said he would. Every time we talked, I kept hoping he'd tell me he was making progress, that he was seeing a therapist or getting some kind of help, but it never came up. And I didn't want to push him, afraid it would lead to another meltdown like the one that had driven us apart in the first place. One Friday afternoon, Michael came home from school, his usual, "It was fine," on the tip of his tongue, but this time, something was different. He lingered in the kitchen a bit longer than usual, his eyes downcast, fidgeting with his backpack. "What's going on?" I asked gently, trying not to push too hard. He hesitated for a moment, then finally spoke. "Is Dad going to be okay?" His question hit me like a ton of bricks. I had been so focused on making sure Michael was okay, on keeping things stable for him, that I hadn't stopped to think about how he might be feeling about Tom. I sat down at the kitchen table, motioning for him to join me. "I hope so," I said honestly. "He's going through a tough time right now, but he's trying to get better." Michael nodded, but I could see the uncertainty in his eyes. "I miss him," he admitted quietly, and my heart broke a little. He didn't say it often, but I knew he loved Tom, even after everything that had happened. I couldn't blame him for that. "I know you do," I replied, reaching out to hold his hand. "We'll figure things out, okay? But right now, we need to give him some time to work on himself." Michael didn't say anything more after that, but I could tell he was thinking about it. Later that night, as I watched him from the doorway of his room, I realized that this new routine wasn't just about adjusting to a different living situation. It was about finding a new normal in the midst of chaos. We were both navigating uncharted territory, and it wasn't going to be easy. I spent the next few days thinking about what Michael had said, wondering if I should let him see Tom. But every time I thought about it, I hesitated. I wasn't sure if Tom was ready, or if it would do more harm than good. It was a constant battle in my mind, weighing what was best for Michael against what I hoped for Tom. As time went on, the routine we'd fallen into at Laura's began to feel more like a temporary solution than a long-term plan. I knew we couldn't stay there forever, but I wasn't sure what the next step would be. For now, we were just getting by, one day at a time, trying to make the best of the situation we were in. Life with Laura became our new normal, but as the days turned into weeks, I could sense that Michael was carrying more weight than he let on. He had always been good at keeping his feelings to himself, but a mother knows when something isn't quite right. His silence was heavier now, like there was something he wanted to say but couldn't find the words. One Saturday morning, as we were having breakfast, Michael seemed quieter than usual. He pushed his food around on his plate, staring out the window as if lost in thought. I decided it was time to talk, to really check in with him, so I sat down beside him, placing my hand gently on his arm. "Hey, buddy, what's going on? You've been really quiet lately." He shrugged, still not looking at me. "I'm fine," he mumbled, but I knew better. I wasn't going to let him brush me off this time. I could feel in my gut that he had something important on his mind, so I took a deep breath and tried again. "Michael, it's okay to talk to me. I know things have been hard, and I'm here for you, no matter what. You can tell me how you're feeling." There was a long pause. I watched as his face twisted with a mix of emotions. Finally, he looked up at me, his brown eyes filled with uncertainty. "Mom, I don't know what's going to happen. With us. With Dad." His words hit me hard. I had been so focused on protecting him from the chaos, trying to keep things as normal as possible, that I hadn't stopped to consider how much uncertainty he must have been feeling. Michael was only 12, but he was carrying the weight of everything, our separation from Tom, the uncertainty of whether we would ever go back home, and his own relationship with Tom. "I know," I said softly, trying to hold back the lump in my throat. "I don't have all the answers right now, but we're going to figure it out, okay? It's going to take time, but we're going to be okay." He looked down at his plate, his voice barely a whisper. "I want to stay with you, Mom. I don't want to go back with Dad." The room fell silent. Those words, the ones I had been dreading but also knew were coming, hung in the air between us. I hadn't expected him to say it so directly, but there it was, out in the open. I felt a wave of emotions wash over me, relief, guilt, and sadness all at once. Relief, because I had been so worried about what was best for him, and now I had his answer. Guilt, because no matter how much I knew this was the right choice, I hated that he had to make it. And sadness, because this decision meant that things with Tom were more broken than I had been willing to admit. I took a deep breath, trying to keep my voice steady. "You don't have to go back with Dad if you don't want to," I assured him. "You're old enough to make that choice, and I'm here to support you. I want you to feel safe and comfortable, and if that means staying with me, then that's what we'll do." Michael nodded, but I could see the conflict in his eyes. "I love Dad, but," he trailed off, struggling to find the words. "He's different now, Mom. I don't know if he's going to get better." Hearing that broke my heart in a way I hadn't expected. Michael had always looked up to Tom, and now he was seeing the cracks in the man who was supposed to be his role model. I could see the confusion on his face, the struggle between loving his dad and being afraid of what might happen if things didn't change. "I know," I said quietly. "It's hard. I know you love him, and that's not going to change. But sometimes, people need time to work on themselves. Your dad has a lot of things to figure out, and it's okay for you to want some space while he does that." Michael didn't say anything for a while, and I gave him the time he needed to process everything. I didn't want to rush him, or push him to talk more than he was ready for. Finally, he nodded, his expression a little lighter than before. "I just don't want to go back to how it was," he said, and I knew exactly what he meant. The tension, the fights, the unpredictability of Tom's behavior, it had all taken a toll on Michael, more than I had realized. He was asking for stability, for peace, and I couldn't deny him that. "You don't have to," I promised him. "We're going to take things one step at a time, and we'll figure this out together." After that conversation, something shifted. Michael seemed more at ease, as if a weight had been lifted off his shoulders. I, on the other hand, was left with a lot to think about. His choice, his decision to stay with me full-time, was a clear signal that our life had changed for good. I had been holding on to the hope that things with Tom might get better, that we could go back to the way things were before. But Michael's words made me realize that we couldn't go back, not really. The next few days were a bit of a blur. I kept replaying that conversation in my head, trying to come to terms with the fact that our family dynamic had permanently shifted. I knew that staying with me was the best thing for Michael, but I also knew that Tom would have to hear about his decision eventually, and that wouldn't be easy. One evening, after Michael had gone to bed, I sat down with Laura in the living room, the familiar hum of her house now a comforting background noise. I told her about Michael's decision, and she wasn't surprised. "He's a smart kid," she said. "He knows what's best for him, even if it's a hard choice." I nodded, but the thought of telling Tom weighed heavily on me. I wasn't sure how he would react, or if he would understand. But one thing was clear, Michael's choice was made, and it was up to me to honor it. After Michael's decision to stay with me full-time, life seemed to settle down a bit. The routine we had built at Laura's house started to feel more familiar, and we both adjusted to this new chapter. But even though things were calmer on the surface, I knew there was still unfinished business: Tom. Michael hadn't spoken to his dad in a couple of weeks, and Tom hadn't reached out either. The silence between them felt heavy, but I didn't want to push it. I knew that sooner or later, we'd have to have the difficult conversation about Michael's choice and what it meant for all of us moving forward. One afternoon, as I was picking Michael up from school, my phone rang. I glanced at the screen and saw Tom's name. My heart skipped a beat. I hadn't heard from him in a while, and I knew this conversation was going to be tough. I answered, trying to keep my voice calm. "Hey, Tom." There was a pause on the other end before he spoke. "Hey. I've been thinking a lot, about everything." I took a deep breath. "Me too. I miss you guys," he said quietly. "I want to see Michael. I want to see both of you. Maybe we can talk, try to figure things out." His words hung in the air for a moment, and I could feel the hope in his voice. It was hard not to get swept up in it, to imagine that maybe we could fix things, that maybe we could go back to how things were before everything fell apart. But I knew it wasn't that simple. "I think we need to talk," I said carefully. "But, Tom, a lot has changed. Michael, he's made some decisions about what he wants, and I need you to be ready for that." "What do you mean?" His voice was tense now, as if he could already sense what was coming. I glanced over at Michael, who was sitting in the passenger seat, staring out the window. I hadn't told him about this call yet, and I wasn't sure how he'd feel about seeing his dad again. "Why don't we meet up somewhere? We can talk face to face." Tom agreed, and we made plans to meet at a park near the house that weekend. After I hung up, I turned to Michael. "That was your dad. He wants to see you." Michael didn't say anything at first. He just stared ahead, his expression unreadable. After a long pause, he finally spoke. "I don't know if I'm ready." "I know," I said gently. "But we need to talk to him. I'll be there the whole time, and if you feel uncomfortable or want to leave, we can. This is your choice, Michael." He nodded, but I could tell he was nervous. Honestly, so was I. This conversation felt like a make-or-break moment for our family, and I wasn't sure how it was going to turn out. When the weekend rolled around, Michael and I drove to the park. My stomach was in knots the entire time, and I could feel the tension in the air. Michael was unusually quiet, and I kept glancing over at him, wondering what was going through his mind. I didn't want to pressure him, but I also knew that this was something we couldn't avoid forever. When we arrived at the park, Tom was already there, sitting on a bench by the playground. He looked different, tired and worn out, like he hadn't been sleeping well. The sight of him brought back a flood of memories, some good, some bad. But I pushed them aside and focused on the present. We walked over to him, and for a moment, it was awkward. No one really knew what to say. Finally, Tom broke the silence. "Hey, Michael," he said softly. "It's good to see you." Michael gave a small nod but didn't say much. I could see the conflict in his eyes. He still loved his dad, but he was also carrying the weight of everything that had happened between us. We sat down together, and Tom looked at me, his eyes pleading. "I know things have been rough, but I want to make it right. I want to work on myself, get the help I need, and maybe we can fix things." His words were filled with hope, but I could see the hesitation in Michael's face. This wasn't something that could be fixed with just words. Tom had said similar things before, but nothing had changed. This time had to be different. I took a deep breath and spoke. "Tom, I'm glad you're ready to work on yourself. I really am. But right now, things are different. Michael has made a decision about what he wants, and I need you to respect that." Tom looked confused. "What decision?" I glanced at Michael, silently asking if he was ready to tell his dad. He nodded, but his voice was shaky when he finally spoke. "I want to stay with Mom. Full time." The words hit Tom like a punch to the gut. I could see the pain flash across his face, and for a moment, I thought he might get angry. But instead, he just looked down at the ground, his shoulders slumping. "I see," he said quietly. "I guess I didn't realize things had gotten this bad." Michael shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "It's not that I don't want to see you, Dad. I need things to be different. I need to feel safe." Tom nodded, but I could see the tears welling up in his eyes. "I understand. I'm going to work on that. I'm going to get better, I promise." We sat in silence for a while after that, the weight of the conversation settling over us. I knew that this wasn't the end, but it was a start. Tom had acknowledged the problem, and now it was up to him to follow through on his promise. As we left the park that day, I couldn't help but feel a mix of emotions. There was relief that the conversation had finally happened, but also sadness for what we had lost. Our family would never be the same, but maybe, just maybe, there was a way to rebuild something new from the pieces. A few weeks passed after the meeting at the park, and I could feel the weight of everything slowly starting to settle. Michael and I had fallen back into our routine at Laura's house. We still hadn't moved out, and I was beginning to wonder when, or if, we would. It felt like we were living in limbo, waiting for Tom to make good on his promise, waiting for the next step in this difficult journey. I hadn't heard from Tom much since the park meeting. He had called once or twice, checking in, asking about Michael, but our conversations were short and awkward. There was still so much left unsaid between us, and I wasn't sure if we were ever going to have the chance to say it. Then one evening, out of nowhere, my phone rang. I was in the middle of making dinner when I saw Tom's name on the screen. For a moment, I hesitated. It wasn't unusual for him to call, but something about this felt different. I glanced at the date and realized it was our wedding anniversary. The thought hit me like a punch in the gut. I had completely forgotten. I picked up the phone, trying to steady my voice. "Hello?" "Hey," Tom's voice came through the line, quieter than usual. I didn't know if I should call, but it's our anniversary. I paused, unsure of what to say. It felt strange to be talking about our anniversary when we were so far apart, both physically and emotionally. "Yeah, I know," I replied softly. "I wasn't sure if you'd remember." There was a long silence on the other end, and I could hear him sigh. "I've been thinking a lot lately. About us. About everything." I leaned against the kitchen counter, my heart pounding in my chest. "What have you been thinking?" "I don't think we're going to be able to fix this," he said quietly. "I've tried. I've been trying, but I don't think I'm healthy enough to be the husband you need, or the father Michael needs. Not right now." His words cut through me like a knife, even though I had been expecting something like this for a while. It was one thing to know, deep down, that things were over. It was another to hear him say it out loud. I felt a lump forming in my throat, but I tried to keep my voice steady. "I don't know what to say," I admitted. "I've been thinking about that too. About how things have changed between us. It's hard." "I know it is," he said. "And I'm sorry for everything I've put you through. I really am. But I think the best thing for both of us is to let go." I stared at the stove, the food simmering on the burner forgotten. I had been holding onto the hope that maybe, somehow, we could fix things. That maybe, if we both tried hard enough, we could find our way back to each other. But now, hearing Tom's voice on the other end of the line, I realized that we had drifted too far apart. "Maybe you're right," I finally said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe letting go is the only way." Another silence settled between us, heavy and thick. I could feel the finality of it, like we were standing at the edge of something we couldn't come back from. "I don't want to hurt you," Tom said, his voice filled with regret. "But I don't think we can go back to how things were. We've changed too much." I swallowed hard, trying to fight back the tears that were threatening to spill over. "I know. I think I've known for a while. I just didn't want to admit it." There was another long pause, and then Tom spoke again, softer this time. "I'm going to file for divorce." The words hung in the air between us, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. Divorce. It was such a final word, one that I had been avoiding, even though I knew it was coming. I had always thought that marriage was something you fought for, something you never gave up on. But now, standing in my sister's kitchen, listening to Tom talk about divorce, I realized that sometimes, the best thing you can do is let go. "Okay," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "If that's what you think is best." "It's not what I wanted," Tom said quickly. "But I don't see any other way. I'm not the man you need me to be, and I don't want to keep holding you back. You deserve better." I wiped a tear from my cheek, trying to compose myself. "You're not holding me back, Tom. I just think we've both changed too much. We're not the same people we were when we got married." "I know," he replied. "And I'm sorry for everything. I really am. I didn't know what else to say, so I just stood there, clutching the phone, letting the reality of what was happening sink in. Our marriage was over. Not with a fight, not with anger, but with a quiet phone call on what would have been our anniversary. "I'll always care about you," Tom said, his voice soft and full of regret. "And I'll always be there for Michael, no matter what." "I know," I said, my voice shaky. "And I'll always care about you too." There was one final pause before Tom spoke again. "Goodbye, Sarah." "Goodbye, Tom." And with that, he hung up, leaving me standing there in the kitchen, staring at the phone in my hand. I felt numb, like everything had just shifted in a way that I couldn't fully process yet. I turned off the stove, suddenly not hungry anymore. My marriage was over, and even though part of me had known it was coming, it still hurt more than I expected. I sat down at the kitchen table, staring at the wall, trying to make sense of it all. That was how my marriage ended, not with a dramatic fight or a big confrontation, but with a phone call on our anniversary, a quiet acknowledgement that we were no longer the people we used to be. The days after that phone call were some of the hardest I'd ever experienced. Knowing that my marriage was officially over, hearing it out loud from Tom, was like a heavy weight pressing down on my chest. I hadn't realized just how much I had been holding on to the hope that we might fix things, even after all the problems, the distance, and the arguments. But now, there was no denying it. Our marriage was done, and I had to figure out what came next. Michael didn't know about the phone call yet. I wasn't ready to tell him. Part of me wanted to protect him from the pain for as long as I could, but I knew I couldn't hide the truth forever. He deserved to know what was going on, and I owed it to him to be honest. But I also wanted to be sure I had a plan before I sat him down and had that conversation. I didn't want him to feel like everything was falling apart. A few days after the call, Laura and I sat down in her kitchen, sipping tea. I told her everything that had happened, about Tom filing for divorce, about how it all went down on what would have been our anniversary. She listened quietly, not interrupting, just letting me get it all out. By the time I finished talking, I felt exhausted, like I had just run a marathon. Laura reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "I'm so sorry, Sarah. I know how hard this must be for you." I nodded, blinking back tears. "It's just. I knew it was coming, but it still hurts. It's like, no matter how prepared you think you are, it still feels like a punch to the gut when it actually happens." She nodded. "Yeah, I get that. But you've been so strong through all of this. You've done everything you could to make sure Michael's okay, and that's what matters. You're going to get through this. I just don't know what comes next," I admitted. "Do I stay here at your house forever? Do I try to find a new place? I feel like everything's so uncertain." Laura gave me a soft smile. "One step at a time. You don't have to figure everything out right away. But you'll find your way. You always do." Her words were comforting, but I still felt overwhelmed. There was so much to think about, how to move forward, how to make sure Michael had the stability he needed, and how to take care of myself in the process. I had spent so much time worrying about everyone else that I had almost forgotten about my own needs. That night, after Michael had gone to bed, I sat down on the couch with a notepad and started making a list. I needed a plan, something to help me feel like I had some control over what was happening. The first thing on the list was finding a new place to live. As much as I appreciated staying with Laura, I knew we couldn't stay there forever. Michael and I needed our own space, a place where we could start fresh and build a new life. The next few days were a whirlwind of searching for apartments and making phone calls. I hadn't realized how hard it would be to find a place that fit our needs. Everything seemed too small, too expensive, or too far away from Michael's school. But I was determined to make it work. I knew that having a new home would be the first step toward rebuilding our lives. Finally, after what felt like weeks of searching, I found an apartment that seemed perfect. It wasn't anything fancy, just a 2-bedroom place in a quiet neighborhood. But it was affordable, close to Michael's school, and it felt like a place where we could start over. I signed the lease and immediately felt a sense of relief, like I was finally making progress. Now came the hard part, telling Michael about the divorce and the move. One evening, after dinner, I sat him down in the living room. He was playing a video game, but when I asked if we could talk, he paused the game and turned to face me. I could see the worry in his eyes. He had been sensing that something was off, and now he was bracing himself for whatever news I was about to give him. "Michael, I need to talk to you about something important," I began, my heart pounding in my chest. "I talked to your dad a few days ago, and, well, he's decided to file for divorce." Michael's eyes widened, and he sat up straighter. "So, you're not getting back together?" I shook my head. "No, sweetheart. We're not. We've both tried, but we've decided that this is what's best for all of us. Your dad still loves you very much, and so do I. But things are going to be a little different from now on." He didn't say anything for a moment, and I could see the wheels turning in his mind as he tried to process what I had just told him. Finally, he spoke, his voice soft and unsure. "Are we still staying with Aunt Laura?" I smiled gently. "No, actually, that's the other thing I wanted to talk to you about. I found us a new apartment. It's not far from here, and it's close to your school. It's going to be just you and me, and I think it's going to be a good place for us to start fresh." Michael nodded, but I could tell he was still unsure. I guess that's okay." I reached out and pulled him into a hug. "I know this is a lot, Michael. It's a big change, and it's okay to feel upset or confused. But I promise you, we're going to be okay. We're going to make this work." He hugged me back, and for a moment, we just sat there in silence, holding on to each other. I knew that this was just the beginning of a long road, but at least we were on it together. In the weeks that followed, we moved into our new apartment. It wasn't easy, but with each box unpacked, I felt like we were one step closer to building a new life. The pain of the divorce was still there, lingering in the background, but it wasn't as sharp anymore. I knew that healing would take time, but for now, I was focused on taking things one day at a time. Michael and I started settling into our new routine. It wasn't perfect, but it was ours, and that was enough. There were still days when I missed Tom, when I wondered what could have been if things had gone differently. But I knew that we had made the right decision, and that gave me peace. In the end, life moves forward. It doesn't wait for you to catch up, and it doesn't pause for you to figure things out. But as long as you keep moving, even when it's hard, you'll find your way. And that's exactly what Michael and I were doing, finding our way, one step at a time.